Hello and welcome to the Washington Times Politically Unstable. I'm Kelly Sadler, the commentary editor at the Washington Times. I apologize to the audience. I'm dealing with a bit of a cold today, so my voice is a bit raspy. But
Sure.
today we're lucky to be joined by Alex Gray. He was a former deputy assistant to the president and chief of staff on the National Security Council under the President Trump's first term. He's also a non-resident fellow at the
Mm.
Atlantic Council. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kelly.
So, the Trump administration, Trump 2.0, just recently released their national security strategy. For those in the audience that are not aware of what this is, it's a rather large document that sets the agenda and the goals, the way the administration sees the world and conflict, um, and sets out those priorities. Alex, you wrote a column for the Washington Times saying that this national security strategy is a bit different than previous administrations. And I was just wondering if you could outline your thoughts when you read through it, what stood out to you, and what makes it unique.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Kelly. What makes it unique is if you look at national security strategies going back to the end of the Cold War under Republicans and Democrats in the White House, they're basically laundry lists. They're not about priorities. They're not about setting goals or matching resources to objectives. They're just a wish list of everything's important. And there's an old saying in strategy that if everything's important, nothing's important. I always use the example, if you look at some of the early national security strategies post Cold War, you basically have an argument that dealing with great powers like Russia and China, it's treated as if it's the same level of importance as dealing with Africa and the Pacific Islands. That's just not true. And I think most Americans who are honest about where our interests lie know that not everything is of equal import to the American people and to our strategic interests. What this document does is it makes a very clear and cohesive case for what the core national interests of the United States are. And in a world of limited resources, how do we deploy those resources to most effectively safeguard our interests? So, what it says in a nutshell, and it's 33 pages, is protecting our homeland, whether that be from illegal migration or from the importation of dangerous drugs or from espionage or what trade practices that put Americans out of work, terrorism against the homeland. That is our principal focus as a government, is to protect the homeland and the American people where they live. Seems axiomatic, seems obvious. It's not always treated that way by our foreign policy establishment. So it builds from there, and the document builds out. Next, it says that the Western Hemisphere, where we live, is essential to our national security. Again, this was not controversial for most of American history. The hemisphere was treated as an obvious, the central area for America's interests because it's where we live. Only since the end of the Cold War have we really started to treat the hemisphere as of secondary importance. The president saying in this document, no, because of drugs, because of narcotics, and most importantly, Kelly, because of the influence of China and Russia and Iran in our hemisphere, we are now going to treat the hemisphere with the importance it deserves, and we're going to push back at the efforts of what the document calls extra hemispheric powers, powers who don't live in our hemisphere, like China, Russia, and Iran. We're going to push back and try and make sure they cannot gain dangerous leverage in our hemisphere. And then finally, what the document does, that I'm, as a person who's worked in Asia policy most of my career, I'm very happy the document says in unambiguous terms, the future of the world economy, the future of American strategy is in the Indo-Pacific. And it's the obligation of the United States to keep the Indo-Pacific free and open. So it's really a chain of objectives: defend the homeland, keep the bad actors, Russia, China, and Iran, out of the hemisphere, and then keep Asia open to commerce and open to, and safe from Chinese malign influence. And everything else is secondary from there.
So everything else is secondary. And right now, you just hit on the three strategic pillars that are outlined in this, but that doesn't include Russia as a top priority. We know that Russia is currently involved in a war with Ukraine, a war of aggression. There's many national security analysts that are saying that stopping Russia, putting an end to this war, helping Ukraine is a vital interest, core strategic interest of the United States. I've argued against that. I don't see how Ukraine is. I would argue that its European neighbors, it's more significant to them than it is to us because we are an ocean away.
I agree with that 100%. And what I would add on top of that, and the reason I think the national security strategy doesn't talk that much about Russia, is simply because Russia's in terminal decline. And this war in Ukraine that Putin launched, this war of aggression, has revealed the incredible weakness of the Russian state, the Russian regime. It is in terminal demographic decline. If you look at all the metrics of societal collapse, abortion rates, suicide rates, alcoholism rates, every metric that would show you the health of a civilization and a country, Russia is in absolute abject. It's coming apart. And the military collapse, we watched Russia unravel militarily. We watched them unravel economically. This is not a long term threat to the United States. And I would argue it's not even a medium term threat to the United States. In the short term, obviously, it poses threats to the equilibrium, the order in Europe. But as you said, Kelly, that is primarily if the goal is to match limited American resources with the highest priority threats to the United States, that is much more a threat to our European allies than it is to us. And if we have to prioritize, I think the president and this NSS is 100% right in saying that that is not the highest thing on the American list of priorities. It's are incumbent upon us to encourage our European friends who are much more directly impacted by Russia's aggression to stand up to Moscow than it is for us to use limited resources in that way.
Alex, there's a lot of China scholars that say China is equally in downfall, in free fall. It's got a population crisis. It's on the verge of economic collapse, and yet this national security strategy does place China as at the forefront of our national security threat. Um, how do you address that issue, the criticism that China is in imminent decline? I know that, I mean, I studied Chinese. I was over in China in the 2000s. People were saying the same thing, but China has only grown domestically since then.
Yeah, I mean, I actually would make the argument, Kelly, that China certainly does have some signs of decline. I mean, they're probably going to have the largest population decline in recorded
Mhm.
history over the next couple of decades. Entirely a self-inflicted wound, of course, because of the one-child policy. They're going to have some serious economic dislocations. What I would argue is China, in the medium and long term, they actually are going to potentially, as they decline economically and demographically, pose more of a threat to the United States and the region. Because when you think about what is the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, what is their legitimacy built on? Their legitimacy is built on providing economic growth and lifting people in China out of poverty. If they can't do that, they have to find another way to justify their relevance and to justify their totalitarian leadership. My argument is they will justify it through nationalism, they will justify it through militarism, and they will justify it through attempting to overseas adventures like taking Taiwan. And so I think that the moment of threat to the United States from China may actually increase as China's weakness grows. The other thing I'd say to contrast Russia and China has so much more latent power. The economy is so much larger. It has so much more depth to it than Russia does. Russia, I don't think at this point you can even compare the two economies and the two systems. And so I think Russia is going to collapse, essentially collapse, long before China gets to the point of having to address some of their structural problems.
Can you talk about China and Russia's tentacles into the Western Hemisphere? We know
Absolutely.
that Russia has had long ties with Cuba, and that our allied forces. Russia also has ties to Venezuela. We've seen Iran's ties to Venezuela with the oil tankers that are leaving Venezuela's ports and smuggling oil into Iran. What about China? Of these three, if you want to call them the axis of evil, China, Russia, Iran, who has the most influence and is the most dangerous to us as a nation in our own hemisphere?
So I would argue it's China because China has come in through its Belt and Road Economic Initiative, and they're claiming infrastructure all over the hemisphere, ports, Huawei telecom networks. They're getting involved in building critical infrastructure, controlling mines, controlling natural resources. They're increasingly having they're becoming the main purchaser of agricultural commodities for places like Brazil and Argentina. They are getting themselves enmeshed deeply in the economies and in the classic way the Chinese Communist Party operates. Economic involvement, they try and translate it very quickly into political and strategic involvement. And we're already seeing the beginning of Chinese strategic and military moves into the hemisphere. So we've seen Chinese Marines come to Brazil and train with the Brazilian Marine Corps. We've seen increasing Chinese warship activity in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Pacific. We're seeing the Chinese increasing their intelligence gathering operations throughout the hemisphere. Very much, I think China sees the hemisphere as an American weak spot because we haven't focused our attention on it the way we should. And just as the Soviets saw the hemisphere as a way to keep us distracted so we don't focus our attention in their own sphere, I think the Chinese see it just the same way. And that's why this NSS is such a necessary corrective because it forces the government and hopefully the American foreign policy establishment to start asking difficult questions about where we're prioritizing in light of what our adversaries are doing. And the other thing I'd say, Kelly, on Iran and on Russia, Russia will continue to try and annoy us, for lack of a better term, in the hemisphere by sending the occasional bomber to Caracas. They obviously are very enmeshed in Cuba. They've propped up the Cuban regime for a long time. To me, those are pinpricks. Those do not constitute a serious threat to the United States, and it's actually, I think, a sign of Russian weakness when they attempt to lash out by sending a warship. I think there was an incident recently where they sent a warship to the Caribbean
Mhm.
to try and show their strength, and the warship broke down because it was in such poor maintenance. So I don't worry about the Russians. I do worry about the Iranians, though, because the Iranians, through Hezbollah and through other proxies, have actually launched terror attacks. You go back to the Buenos Aires bombings, synagogue bombings in the mid 90s, which were perpetrated by Hezbollah. There is very much an Iranian, go down to the tri-border area, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. There is absolutely a history of infiltration by Islamist radicals with Iran's support into our hemisphere. So I think we have to be very cognizant from a counterterror perspective of what the Iranians are trying to do. So if I had to rank it, I would say China is the largest strategic threat. Iran has a very real terror nexus that we have to be mindful of, and the Russians are using our hemisphere for signaling and basically just to be a nuisance.
Posturing. Um, why Venezuela? Why all the attention on Venezuela from this administration right now? You've talked about the some, the hemisphere as being, Brazil is a part of it. Buenos Aires, you just talked about Argentina. You got also Mexico, which China is sending over precursors to fentanyl, which are
Yes.
being smuggled over the Mexican border. But all of the administration's attention seems to be on Venezuela, and if they can achieve regime change there, all the other dominoes will fall. Can you talk to me about that and what the strategy is, and why not focus on other
Yeah.
countries within the region? Why kind of singling out Venezuela?
Sure. So a couple things here. Yes, the narco trafficking is absolutely that is the key piece here. And if you go back to the national security strategy, and you can see the fingerprints of our former colleague Stephen Miller here, Stephen has long argued that you have to tie defense of the homeland directly to the activities of regimes, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's Mexico, whether it's elsewhere, whether it's China, who are importing with fentanyl, other drugs, killing Americans in the homeland. There's a direct tie between national security and what's happening to our communities at home. And I think Venezuela is the best example of that because the narco trafficking, the cartels, Cartel of the Sun is a great example. They are truly a part of the Venezuelan regime. It is impossible to separate cleanly the Maduro ruling regime with narco trafficking. They're one and the same. And from an intelligence perspective and from a strategic perspective, it's really, they're inseparable. And so I think what the president's trying to do is twofold. He's trying to encourage changes where either the Venezuelan regime would stop this behavior or Maduro would leave and allow for a regime that's more cooperative in cracking down on this behavior. And because of the presence of China and Russia and Iran and Venezuela, this is the best example yet of what's the national security strategy calls the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that it is our national interest to push back on the presence of extra hemispheric powers in our hemisphere. Venezuela is the locus of Chinese, Russian, and Iranian activity, that malign activity in the hemisphere. So the president's essentially doing he's kind of getting a double whammy. He's going after the narco trafficking that's inseparable from Maduro, and he's saying that the influence of our adversarial regimes, we're going to put a stop to that. But one thing I want to make clear, Kelly, and I think this has been confused by some of our friends in the conservative movement, the president is not advocating regime change the way George W. Bush advocated regime change in Iraq and Afghanistan. The president's not trying, in my view, to install a democratic regime and force, nation build in Caracas. I
Mhm.
don't think that's what the president's trying to do. I think the president's trying to get a leader in Venezuela who's willing to take American interests, take seriously America's core strategic interests. And if that's not Nicolas Maduro, I don't get the sense the president is particularly interested in the contours of the regime. He's interested in whoever is in charge in Caracas is respectful of America's core interests. And I think that's very different from the nation building we did in the Middle East and South Asia for 20 years.
And so what does that detail? Because it could be another adversarial leader. It could be a narco terrorist, right? If they don't get in um, the leadership that they want. So, what does respecting America's interests in Venezuela look like, no matter who is in charge?
Yeah, so I think it's number one, you got to put a stop to the narco trafficking. You've got to put a stop to any official connivance in narco trafficking. You have to proactively help the United States crack down on the flow of drugs and precursors into the US that are killing our people every single day. That's number one. Number two, you have to stop the malign influence of overseas actors, Russia, China, Iran, in the Venezuelan energy sector and in Venezuelan political institutions. We cannot continue to have the export of authoritarian regimes who do not share our interests. We cannot continue to have them with a major presence in such a significant country geopolitically that's right on the shores of the Caribbean. That's just a no-go. So I think that's the president's twofold, trying to stop the drugs from a direct homeland defense standpoint, and the president is trying to say, going back to this Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, we cannot allow Venezuela to be a haven for malign adversarial powers who are trying to undermine our interests in our own hemisphere.
So, let's say that happens. What's next? Because Venezuela serves as not only, it traffics drugs through its country, but also illegal immigration, right, from other countries kind of flow through Venezuela as well. But then if you solve the problem with Venezuela, you still got problems in Cuba. You still
Yes.
got the China's Belt and Road Initiative that they've done and built out in other countries. You still have issues with the Panama Canal. Where? where does this all go, and what does success in the region ultimately look like?
Yeah, so I think, where this goes is I think we're starting to slowly see the focus in Washington, the kind of the mindset behind people in policy positions and think tanks shifting to, let's start thinking proactively about how to secure the hemisphere. And this is, I think, the biggest challenge the president's going to face is a foreign policy elite who have been for 30 years have been conditioned to think that what happens far away from us is somehow more important than what's happening in our own neighborhood. And that's a mindset that has to be changed. And I think this strategy is a key part of moving that needle and getting people to think differently. But it's going to take time. And so that's number one. Number two, like, what does success look like? Success looks like the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine becomes a living document that we execute in policy. So that means China is not welcomed by regimes in the hemisphere to send to do regular port calls. We are not allowing you look at the new leader in Chile, who has been very open about his concern about Chinese
Mhm.
activity in Chile. The U.S. welcomes him as an ally with open arms, and we start working collaboratively with the new President Cast. We start working with him to find ways to push back on Chinese influence in economic and political influence in Chile. That means offering commercial alternatives from the United States. With obviously the private sector is our great advantage here, but the US government encouraging private sector investment through things like the Development Finance Corporation to come into Chile, Peru, Ecuador, places that have aligned regimes, right of center regimes, Argentina, coming in and trying to encourage and match make us to be the partner of choice rather than the Chinese Communist Party. So I think if we look, 3 years from now, 10 years from now, a successful American approach to the hemisphere would be right of center leaders who have been empowered by successful partnerships with the United States to bring additional foreign and primarily American investment into their countries in infrastructure, in new industries. They are moving towards the US instead of China. Belt and Road has stagnated or even been turned backward in some cases. The US is serving as more of a market for these countries than China, and we're growing. We're becoming much more of the trading partner of choice for commodity producers in the region. And then we're also, I think, growing our security ties. We're working collaboratively with Ecuador, with a post Maduro Venezuela, with Peru, with Chile, maybe at some point a post Lula Brazil, to crack down on narco trafficking, to crack down on Islamist terrorism that Iran is inculcating. So it's going to be a region that is much more conducive to U.S. interests on migration, on narco trafficking, and on countering China than the one that we've had for the last couple decades.
Well, Alex Gray, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been very informative.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.